Okay.
Great. I don't know if he's around or not. Is he here today? Okay.
I don't think so. He teaches on Tuesday and Thursday, typically tries to stay on campus when he teaches. Because he lives like a little further away.
I'm tempted to see if I could turn that around and use the rear-facing camera so I don't see myself and get distracted. Because if you do much public speaking, then you know that you kind of have to like get outside of yourself to not get wigged out doing it. And if you start seeing yourself or listening to yourself, you find like, same with musicians, right? I mean, you know when you're kind of in the zone, and then you know when you're like listening to yourself play. You're like, I'm gonna mess this up. I'm gonna say something wrong. It's not gonna be good. So let me just turn this off. There's also having a marker on if we're not using the swivel part. So maybe we'll experiment with that. You can be the dedicated videographer. Sit there with sit there and make sure follow me and make it harder on the students. So good to be back. Good to see everybody. Hope you're having a good week. And thankfully, I guess we don't meet on Friday because it's sounding like more and more we might get ice and snow. So that'll save us missing a class meeting. So yeah, we'll get to your question, Dominic. Dominic had a good question about whether a statement could be true for one person and not true for another person. And that I can't speak for everyone, but a lot of philosophers, right? Analytic philosophers at least want to resist that idea and think that, you know, the objectivity of truth or objective theories of truth imply that you can't have that kind of, you know, that's some bad relativity or relativism. And we can talk some about that, because there's what Feldman says and then my sort of take on that. Is your discussion you're referring to with Zimmerman, is that something you're having like ongoing this semester, or is this from the past?
This is from a class in the past.
Yeah.
But it was kind of like.
What was he saying exactly?
Well, so it kind of had to deal with like circumstantial relativism. So like depending on the circumstances, something that could be true for you could also be false for me, and vice versa. And like he gave an example of like, you know, telling a lie, and like, you know, he gave an example of like how like if you know, I did something wrong and somebody asked me if I did it wrong and I lied, yeah, that's wrong. But let's say somebody's like, you know, he gave an example of Bert and Ernie. You know, Bert's running down the street, he comes in your house looking for protection from Ernie. Ernie's trying to kill him. Ernie knocks on the door and says, hey, is Bert in here? You say, no, Bert's not here. Well, in that case, it's okay to lie. Whereas in the first case, it wasn't okay to lie. So like in one case, like, well, in both cases you have, you know, hey, it's not okay to lie, but in one case it's true, in another case it's false.
Yeah.
So it's based on circumstances.
Right.
So I guess if you have more like an objective theory of like how, like an empirical claim, yeah, that probably can't be true and false, but there are certain, I guess, moral claims you can make. Maybe.
I wish we had Professor Zimmerman here, because he's a great guy to talk about all this stuff with. He's super duper smart. I mean, just off the cuff, one thing I want to do is get clear on exactly what statement is at issue, because one way of understanding the objective theory or the correspondence theory is that it applies to single statements, and in my opinion, a lot of disagreement takes place in everyday life and in philosophy, because people are in such a hurry to either state their position or criticize the other position that they don't get clear on exactly whether there's a single statement that's being made at all, right? So like in some cases, this is a different kind of example, but well, I could take that one. I mean, it might be that, you know, if the question is, you know, is it always right to keep a promise, or to, you know, to be honest, not to tell a lie? Is it always wrong to tell a lie? I mean, certainly there are ethical theories that would say, well, no. I mean, like if you're a consequentialist, if you're a utilitarian, right? I mean, the only action that's always and everywhere morally right is the act that in fact will maximize the consequences, the utility, right? So if you're an actual consequentialist, then that would be the only kind of act. So murder, murder's, you know, telling a lie, keeping a promise, any of these different things could, in the right set of circumstances, go the other way, because, just assuming utilitarianism here, right, as a background view, because the consequences could vary, right, in the one case or the other, or there could be different background considerations, like, you know, the Nazis show up and you're harboring Anne Frank and her family, and they ask if you've got Nazis, you know, do you tell the truth there? A lot of people would have the intuition that, no, at least be morally permissible before you break that rule. But yeah, it's hard stuff, and it is kind of come up, if we can get to it, if we make enough progress. So thanks, I appreciate that. So a couple of preliminary things just before we get back into philosophy. I'll be posting the third discussion board question later this evening for you. I didn't want to, I have been reading the discussion posts that you guys are doing. My plan is probably, I mean, I may occasionally jump in and comment, depending on what's going on and whether I want to do it or not. Some of what I'm after in those is, it's a forum for you guys to talk, right? Like you all know each other and your friends, and you have the in-class experience, and then you have that opportunity for discussion. I was pleased with a lot of them, really good stuff. I read through them over the weekend and before class today, and it definitely provides me with a jumping off point for what we do in class, because as I sort of said at our last meeting and before, I really kind of prefer it not to be like a didactic lecture. I mean, I can come in and do an hour and 15 minutes of epistemology, but I think you get more out of talking and asking questions about things that are of interest to you, and see if anything I have to say is going to help you there. But it'll be a mix, I'm sure, a little bit of both. But keep up the good work on the discussion boards. If you haven't done the discussion post, it's okay. I mean, I'm going to grade them all at the end, and that'll be one grade as a chunk for your discussion contributions. But I do encourage you. I mean, what I would hope to do is have it posted on Monday for the following Monday. That way I can see what you guys were getting and what you might not have gotten, and that provides me with some indication as to what to do in class. What I'll do this time is I'll post tonight, and then if you can get it in by Sunday night so that I can have it for next Monday, that'd be great. But if it's going to take until next Wednesday, that's all right too. And I encourage you to do that. Try not to wait. If you can keep up with it weekly, that's a lot better than waiting until the very end of the semester and just being slammed with all these discussion posts that you've got to crank out in a hurry. The other thing that I wanted to do while I'm thinking about it is send around again I've typed up a list here of articles, as well as the people who have already said that what they want to do or what they think they want to do. And the reason why I'm kind of pushing this is multifold. First, we all know that you got to get on this stuff early. If you end up waiting around, it just doesn't go as well. It'll also give you time to look at these articles, and with enough time to change your mind. If you say, well, I haven't read any of these things yet, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it or not. Maybe something I'm not interested in, or maybe something I don't understand. Because once we get out of the Feldman book, the idea is, the first half of the course gets you up to speed, because I'm assuming that nobody's had any theory of knowledge before, which I think is pretty fair. Didn't it turn out most people hadn't? Because 319 gets offered, but over the past 5 years, it's been more sporadic, because Dr. Leplin's been teaching it. So take a look at those, and like I say, if you put your name beside one, it doesn't mean it's not set in stone. But what you can do is then you've got the incentive, the motivation to say, okay, I'm going to look at these articles and make a decision whether I want to stick with it or not. And I'll be providing more details for what my expectations are for that when the time comes. I mean, I realize more than you guys know that public speaking is definitely not everybody's cup of tea, and I don't want to put people in a situation where they feel, anxiety over that. The good news is, from what I can tell, you guys don't have any problems talking. People are participating and talking. It's just leading a discussion of the topic. It's not a formal kind of thing. Whether I'll record them or not, I might, if they're short enough, and then put them up for. I think we've got 2 online people in the online section of the class, and I want them to have as much of a continuous experience with what you're getting as possible. So that's that part. I don't think there's anything else. I guess that's it. So last time I kind of did a tour de force of what I call my basic terms and concepts, and it's that page and a quarter worth of stuff that's out there. I think it's either in modules. I think it's in the modules link or the pages link on our Canvas page. Feel free to download it and print it out if you want it, just for your own reference. What that was really about was, after you took the pretest, giving me a sense of where people were, because you're all philosophy majors, you're all graduating seniors, but you've had different courses at different institutions with different professors, and some of this stuff might have been your freshman year, and then you spent the rest of the time doing social and political philosophy, or you just hadn't looked at it quite that way recently. we got as far, if I can remember, as the concept of a strong argument. So this is terminology I'm going to be using. You know, the objective theory of truth and the one truth value principles. Those are my own kind of monikers for those. But I'm sure you recognize the objective theory of truth is basically just the correspondence theory of truth that Feldman talks about. And in the literature on truth, that's what it goes by. That's what it goes under. So I got as far down, I think, as what a strong argument is. I don't know if people remember that or not, but we talked about validity, we talked about cogency. Remember that cogent arguments, as I'm understanding them, that word gets used in other contexts. People say, well, your argument's not cogent, or you need to present a cogent argument. And oftentimes when they use that word that way, what they're meaning is an argument whose premises are persuasive, or something like that, compelling. I'm not using that word that way. I'm using it as the name for the form that all inductive arguments have, right? So we know that a good deductive argument is a valid argument, right? Good deductive reasoning is reasoning that involves the use of valid arguments. When it comes to inductive reasoning, there's just not been any consensus among epistemologists and people in logic, as far as I can tell, as to what we should call those things. So the word strong has gotten used, the word cogent's gotten used, inductively good. It's very awkward, right? Doesn't roll off the tongue easily, but I've heard people say that. So we've got the valid arguments. They're the ones where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. There'd be no possible world where all the premises are true and the conclusion's false. So hopefully everybody's good on deduction, validity. I hadn't looked recently enough to remember the range of scores, but if you didn't do as well as you thought you would do, then I think there's probably two possibilities. One is that you just need a refresher on some of the basic concepts, and the other one might be that you were thrown off by some of my language because it was not idiosyncratic, but it might have been different than what you got in a critical thinking course, an intro logic course, your first philosophy course, where they typically do this stuff. So you might, if you have questions about any of the questions you missed, and you know them, now's a great time to ask, because other people get the benefit. If you can't remember them, but you still would like to know why you got it wrong, then shoot me an email or post it as an adjunct to the discussion board, right? I'll create another discussion board that says something like, ask the instructor, so that you guys have an easy way, and then everybody can see my answers back to you and get some benefit from that. So we know that arguments are divided into well-formed and ill-formed. We know the well-formed arguments are either deductive and they're valid, or they're inductive and they're cogent. The inductive arguments, remember, are the ones where if the premises were true, then the conclusion is probably true, but it's not necessarily true. It's not guaranteed to be true. The way I'm understanding probability here is anything greater than 0.5 but less than a probability of 1. What that means is that unlike deductive arguments, these valid arguments, right, the inductive ones, the cogent arguments, can come in, it's a continuum. They can come in degrees of strength, which is what you want, because depending on how good the evidence is, right, you might think that you should adjust the strength, the degree of belief that you've got, or the degree of conviction that you've got in the probability of the proposition. If it's only supported, and this again is kind of hand waving, but if the premises only confer 54%, let's say, we're just throwing darts at a board, but 54% probability on the conclusion, right? Like this weather forecast on Friday, it's the weather, arguably inherently unpredictable, right? Science of weather. Not that it's not science, but you see how often they get it right and how often it's not. A lot can change between now and Friday morning, right? It hasn't happened yet, and so at this point, you've got all these different weather models, and what should we believe? Is it going to be a rain event? Is it going to be a little bit of wintry mix? Are we going to get 8 inches of snow? I mean, big ice storm, right? Whatever. So this far out, maybe the evidence that I've got available to me justifies me in believing there's going to probably be some winter action on Friday, but I don't want to bet the family farm on it, right? I'm not all in. As we start getting closer and closer to the time, and the models start to converge, which is hopefully what will happen, right? The European model and the North American model and all these things, then you'll hear the forecasters, they'll be tightening it down a little bit and making a more solid prediction. So anything from greater than 0.5 up to less than a probability of 1 on that spectrum is how I'm thinking about these inductive arguments, so-called cogent arguments. And we'll have a chance, I think, probably when we talk about skepticism in Feldman and, you know, sort of the problem of induction, Hume's famous problem. How many people are familiar with that? Just out of curiosity, Hume's problem? Okay, so this is exactly what I need, though, is that kind of feedback, because I can tell you from experience, I sat through plenty of undergraduate philosophy courses and plenty of graduate level philosophy courses where I wasn't sure I knew what they were talking about. And that's, you know, we can avoid that and get us all on the same page. So after we've assessed the argument's form, we want to think about whether or not we want to assess the quality of the premises, right? I call that the content side of the equation. So arguments have sort of two dimensions of evaluation. There's the form of the argument. Is it deductive or inductive, valid or cogent? And then there's, are the premises any good? Now, everybody will remember from the wonderful experience that you had in logic, right, that that there's this notion of a sound argument. And anybody remember, we talked about it last time, but just as a refresher, anybody want to say, what is it for an argument to be sound?
For an argument to be sound, it's got to have all true premises and true conclusion in the real world.
Yeah, and what's the form of the argument got to be?
Deductive.
Yeah, it's a valid argument, right? So by definition, a sound argument, this is a term drawn from formal logic, a sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a great concept and it's serviceable. But I've, over the years, gotten away from using that, at least in my intro courses with students. And the reason why is twofold. First of all, it only applies to valid arguments. And that's fine if that's all you're messing with, like in most introductory formal logic courses, it's all deduction, right? You get sentence logic and predicate logic, and there's no mention of inductive logic because it gets a lot harder. It involves probability and things. So one limitation is that this idea of assessing whether an argument, a philosophical argument, is a sound argument or not, is that it's got to be deductive reasoning, it's got to be a valid argument, and that's a limitation. The second thing that I'm not nuts about, and why I've kind of gotten away from using that language, is that, as you guys know from lots of undergraduate philosophy that you've had, how much agreement is there about philosophical arguments, right? I mean, unless your experience was radically different than mine, there's usually a considerable amount of disagreement, even among professionals, right, who do this all the time. You go to these conferences and hear the papers delivered, and you sit in on our colloquia and go to these things, right? And that's what makes it fun. That's why we all like philosophy. I'm assuming y'all do, right? Sometimes. So, you know, the fact that there's so much disagreement often leads to people saying, well, look, we can't know whether these premises are true or not, right? And so I'm gonna have to suspend judgment or whatever. That can be an argument stopper, right? I mean, that can be kind of a ploy or something that basically just shuts down the discussion because people are inclined to say, well, you know, you think the premises are true, I'm not sure the premises are true, so that's it, we're done. I want to be able to go beyond that. And so by appealing to the following consideration, instead of whether the argument's premises are true, ask yourself, are the argument's premises rationally justified for me right now? That's a question I think all of us can answer, even if we can't say with absolute Cartesian certainty that the premises are true. You're rarely going to get that in my experience with any interesting philosophical arguments. They just don't work that way. So my notion of a strong argument can be defined as follows. An argument's a strong argument for a person at a time if and only if, one, the argument is either valid or cogent. So it's got to be deductive or inductive, right? And then two, the second thing is that all of the argument's premises need to be justified, and we'll say a lot about justification this time and next time, need to be justified for the person who's considering the argument, who's evaluating the argument. I thought I had the right set of notes. Let me put it back up here for you. Just so you...
This is on campus, right?
Yeah, this is out there. It should be, I can't remember if it's under modules or if it's under, make sure you get enough light on these things. How's that? So, we got this idea of an argument's being strong for a person at a time. It looks to me like it's a little blurry, but it could just be, hey, it's good. It's my eyes. I'm getting old. I'm gonna wear glasses now to do anything, to read for sure. So, that's the language I'll be using. and in your final papers, which you'll be revising, and in your little presentation that you'll be leading discussion on when your time comes. That's the kind of stuff I'd like to be able to see is, you know, you're going to reconstruct, you know, Smith's argument against, you know, Cartesian skepticism, and then use this kind of terminology to assess the argument. Is the argument strong or not? A couple of things that are worth pointing out here. First of all, notice that this is the first relativization that we've encountered. Everything that I blew through last time up to this point was all the objective stuff, right? Now we get this thing of an argument's being strong for a person. Doesn't make any sense to say that an argument is sound for a person, right? On the assumption of an objective theory of truth, right? Because whether the premises are true or not doesn't depend on anything about what the person believes or thinks. Just depends on something like the correspondence theory, whether the premises correspond to the facts, known or unknown, right? So you don't have that possibility there, but here you do. We can say, and sometimes it's useful to say, that this is possible for an argument to be strong for one person and not strong for another person. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the second clause in the definition, right? Determining whether or not all of the argument's premises are justified, right? For the person who's evaluating the argument, that takes us into a discussion of justified belief. And the last little part here, which is basically a scaled down version, a very minimalistic version of what Feldman will develop in considerable detail during the course of this book, basically. One good thing about him, whether you agree with him on everything or not, which I'm sure you won't, is that he does defend a point of view, right? It's not intended to be so neutral as to just be presenting positions. He wants to defend what he thinks is the right stance on a lot of these questions. So 2 parts of this, and we'll get a fuller version of it throughout the semester, but certainly some of the papers that are options for you to sign up for. I think I had 2 papers in there by Feldman and his cohort, Earl Connie, another one of my mentors and dissertation advisor. They wrote a tremendous amount together, and kind of like Hoffman and Rosencrantz sort of thing. They're just a good pairing. So there's a couple papers if you wanted to pursue any of those, feel free. So this first thing here is the belief principle, and that's what Feldman's called it in other contexts. And the idea is that this is simply a descriptive principle. It's not an evaluative or a normative principle. Hopefully that language makes sense to you. By all means, if it doesn't, since I can't directly introspect the contents of your minds, let me know, right? I mean, puzzled looks, confusion, boredom, all of these things are part of the package, but it won't bother me a bit if people just say, like, can you say what you're meaning by that? So if you've had courses in ethics, which I'm sure many of you have, probably that's maybe been most of your experience, you've heard somebody use the words normative, evaluative, right? To say that a claim is a normative claim or an evaluative claim is simply to say that it's doing some appraising, it's ranking, it's assessing, right? So if I have a chocolate cake and I describe the size of the cake and how it's decorated and what the ingredients are that went into the cake, that's all purely at the level of description. When I go on and go beyond that and I say, oh, and by the way, it's an excellent cake. It's one of the best chocolate cakes of its kind I've ever tasted. That's to rate it, that's to evaluate it, that's to say something by way of assessment, right? We've gone beyond the level of just pure description, and we've crossed over into the land of value, right, and valuation. In some other context, you might have come across the so-called naturalistic fallacy, or the is-ought fallacy, trying to derive an ought from an is, as the saying goes. So in any case, this belief principle is intended to be a purely descriptive principle that tells you what your epistemic options are, your so-called doxastic options. That's a fancy word that I should write up, but all they left me was this big chunk of pink chalk. That's not my thing. Here's a word. A word? Can you believe this? I mean, seriously? It's ridiculous. Yeah. So here's a word that you may or may not have come across, but I'll use it. And I'll also put this one up, which I'm sure you have come across because I've heard some of you say it. So the first one here is doxastic. And doxa, the Greek root word there, means pertaining to belief. So a fancy way of talking about beliefs is to talk about one's doxastic options or doxastic states. That gets used in the literature, and the more of that kind of technical language that I can get out early on, the better you'll do when we get finished with Feldman and we start the second half and we start reading the professional literature, because there's often a big gap between the sort of introductory presentations of things and what you find in the articles and in the journals. So that's doxastic, and this is a belief principle. It's a principle about what your options are concerning beliefs. And what it says is that for any proposition that a person considers at a time, he or she has exactly 3 options. They've either got to believe the statement, they've got to disbelieve the statement, right? I think of disbelief like Feldman does. It's just believing the negation, right? Believing that it's not the case, that it's raining outside, as opposed to that it is. Or a third option, which we don't get when it comes to theories of truth generally, at least theories of truth that respect the law of excluded middle, right? So typically, people say, well, your options vis-a-vis truth are it's either true or it's not true. We call the not true things the false, right? And this guy says, well, what about something that's neither true nor false? Well, excluded middle takes care of that, right? Barring worries about quantum mechanics or something, right? Weird stuff at the quantum level. So yeah, this is classical bivalent two-valued logic. This is the logic you learned in 310. When it comes to belief, though, here we're in epistemology, right? And the options there seem to not be limited to just 2 things. It seems like there really is this third option, which we call suspending judgment, right? You're probably familiar with some of this language, or maybe you've heard this before. The idea is that when you suspend judgment, you don't believe it and you don't disbelieve it, right? You don't take a stand either way when it comes to belief. And of course, one interesting question is that we'll have to think about is suspending judgment ever rationally the right thing to do? Ever what you epistemically ought to do? So that other word up there on the bottom, epistemic, you've seen that perhaps a sort of cognitive epistemology. And it just means referring to knowledge, right? So we talk about epistemic justification for believing. That's the kind of justification that a belief has to have if it's to rise to the level of knowledge, rise to the level of counting as something that we would correctly describe as being known or as knowledge, all right? So the belief principle, let me stop for a second and see if people have questions about any of this, because I can wrap this up pretty quick and then hopefully get us at least through 1 and possibly chapter 2 of Feldman. Good so far? All right, so keep in mind that the belief principle is often misunderstood in various ways. One thing people might say is that, what about propositions that I can't understand? Well, then you're not really considering them, right? These are propositions in a language that are graspable, that you know. We're not talking about complicated mathematical claims or logical claims that you could just look at it all day and never understand what's being said. Another option here is, another thing to think about is that the way I think of the belief principle, it's indexed to a time. A lot of times I'll just suppress the time reference just for to minimize wordiness. But the belief principle is compatible with you changing your beliefs over time, as well it should be, right? I mean, right now I'm inclined to believe we're going to get a weather event Friday, but when I wake up Friday morning, if there's not anything happening, then I'll change my mind. I'll say, well, something happened. We're not going to get it. So think of what the belief principle says as what your options are when you're fully considering a proposition. And again, there's some hand waving here because people have written dissertations just on that kind of stuff, right? I mean, what's actually involved in grasping a proposition? Propositions are weird, and grasping is weird because you might believe that Clark Kent works in the office beside you, and Clark turns out to be identical with Superman, but you certainly don't believe Superman works in the office beside you, right? So there's what we refer to as opacity. To say that when it comes to propositional attitudes, some of them are opaque in the sense that substitutivity of identity fails. You can take a claim about identity and put one name in there and the person would believe it, put another name in there and they wouldn't believe it because they fail to know who the person is in question. So from there, we want to ask, after the belief principle, okay, great, so I get my options are believe, disbelieve, and suspend. That just describes what is the case. Now keep in mind, there's other stuff that's not believing. There's hoping and fearing and wishing and all kinds of other propositional attitudes, mental states that seem to take a proposition as their object. And the belief principle is silent on those. It doesn't say anything. I mean, you might believe that it's going to snow on Friday, but hope that it doesn't because you don't want to get out of class. We know that's not the case, right? That never happens. Yeah.
It does seem like in order to fear a proposition or to have a feeling about it, you have to believe it, or you have to have some kind of
attitude toward
it. Exactly.
Yes, I mean, but does it seem right to you that it looks like you could believe something, right, and yet hope? So you could believe that it's not true and hope that it is, or you could believe that it's true and wish that it weren't. You know, a lot of practical kind of everyday examples, you know, come to mind for that sort of thing. So again, it's just a principle about your belief options. Now, if you're not convinced that, if you think there are more options, then I'd like to know what they are. And if you think that suspending judgment shouldn't be in there, then, or if we need to talk about suspending judgment, I'm fine with doing that too, right? I mean, Alan's got a look on his face.
Yeah, I just had an idea. I don't know if this is directly dealing with what we're talking about. What about propositions dealing with like aesthetic value? Like, say we listen to the same piece of music,
Yeah.
and you like it, but I don't like it. Is the music? What is the music? Is it good or is it not good?
Great, yeah. Well, this is going to come up again when we talk about relativism a little bit and how to handle disagreement, right? I mean, my earlier little spiel about it being really important to figure out what statement is really, what the relevant statement or statements are in response to Dominic's original question. I think that makes a difference here because, you know, when somebody says, you know, I'm thinking of that Norwegian metal film you were referencing, somebody says that, you know, Morbid Angel is the best of all time or something, and somebody else says, no, they're not. It looks like a case of disagreement, right? And you might think that things like that are just kind of silly because they're silly to argue about because it all just evolves into people's preferences, and you can't really argue those. I mean, if chocolate's my favorite color ice cream and you like vanilla or flavor ice cream, right? What's the point of even going there, right? So there's different ways to solve the problem or to resolve it. One thing you could say is, is there a single statement that these two parties are disagreeing about, right? If when the first person says chocolate's the best, maybe all they mean is that I, Smith, like chocolate or prefer chocolate. And when you say no, chocolate's not the best, all you mean is no, I Alan, like vanilla the best. Yeah, Tyler.
It just seems like that's like a matter of unpacking the question, because like to just say something, it's like saying she's the evil witch. It's like, well, what is that? That's like so many meanings contained in those words that's like you're not really even saying it. Fact about reality.
We need a single statement, or disambiguate the statements. Yeah.
Well, to me, whenever it comes to like preferences and like taste, if you don't like sit there and agree on like some like objective qualities that like you need to assign that like that makes that the best. If you can't agree on that, then there's no reason to talk about it. So like, if you want to say, okay, chocolate's the best, as in like more people eat chocolate than vanilla, then like you can have a argument there.
Because there's an empirical matter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then if you like remove the empirical matter from taste questions, then it's just okay.
You think it's just silly.
Yeah. Exactly.
I'm inclined to agree. So yeah, I mean, I think that, and I was just going to say, following up on you here, that you know, so one option when you get into those kind of like apparent disagreements that seem to be involving preferences or taste is you say, well, look, probably this is what statement you're really intending when you say what you say. And they often refer back to the speaker, right? They have that I in them, which makes them an indexical, which also means that when I make a statement about myself, it's concerning me, and when you use the same word in English, I, in the first person personal pronoun, it has that interesting semantic feature about the context. It refers to you. So in fact, we're really not disagreeing. We're just each making a statement about ourselves, and we're confused.
So it's sort of like a belief.
So there's that, yeah. But there's also what Dominic's suggesting, which is another thing Feldman points out. Maybe less often a strategy depending on what the topic is, but certainly you may not think that there could be interesting debates over chocolate and vanilla because either there aren't any absolute standards that could really be defended when it comes to something like that. But people don't often, philosophers at least often, don't want to say that about morality, right? They don't want to say that all you mean when you say abortion is wrong is that I believe abortion is wrong. And all you say when you say it's not is that you don't believe it, because that makes the disagreement disappear. And you might think, well, that's good, getting rid of disagreement, but actually it's not, because we don't want to get rid of genuine disagreements, because then we've changed the topic, right? I mean, yeah, sure, I might be interested in letting people know what my beliefs on the matter are, but I'm also expressing a view about abortion in the case at hand, right? So if we can, even if we can't get some consensus about what would constitute the morally right-making features of an act, let's say, I think people are less inclined to take that tact with debates in moral philosophy or in religion, depending. Certainly controversial issues in politics, right? So maybe when it comes to heavy metal music and ice cream, it's implausible to think that there could be objective standards that these things that we could then look to see whether they meet them, right? But that's certainly not going to apply. Certainly not going to be the case that goes for everything, or at least not without additional argument. So good one. So this last little bit here on evidentialism. Now we've gone from the belief principle, which is a descriptive principle, to the second part, right? I mean, the belief principle tells us what our options are, and but doesn't tell you which one you should do. And here I'm talking, I use the word should, which again is an evaluative concept, right? And you've seen should in a lot of different contexts. There's the should of morality. What should one do morally speaking, or what is one's moral obligation? There's the should of legality. What are the options in terms of what's legal, right? Permissible according to the law. There's financially should. What's in your financial self-interest, right? That's a question that makes sense. There's also, I think, but this is more controversial maybe, that there's an epistemics dimension to this. We can ask, what should you, instead of what should you do, what should you believe, right? And we probably all had encounters with people before who either struggle with that idea that we can evaluate beliefs from that sort of standpoint in terms of the should of rationality, of epistemic rationality, or people who just think to themselves, well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's my beliefs. I can believe whatever I want to believe. I mean, so I'm not rational, okay? Life goes on, right? I mean, there's even been some literature, and folks that are familiar with cognitive science and psychology would know better than me maybe, but there's been some literature in the philosophy of mind and in epistemology by people like Stephen Stitch and others, sort of really criticizing this sort of what they consider to be the sort of standard view that Feldman points out, right? Where the holy grail would seem to be to get knowledge, but if we can't get knowledge, then justified belief would be really good too, right? And these folks have suggested in different ways that maybe most people just really don't care if their beliefs are justified, or maybe rationality is not as valuable as epistemologists want to make it out to be. It's one thing. It's one virtue that a belief can have. It's one good. It's one if that's part of your value system, right? I mean, if you prize being rational by whatever the metric is, whatever the standard. So evidentialism comes along, and that's Feldman and Connie's label for it, not mine. And they've got an entire book called Evidentialism, and they sort of are the people for that kind of view, although there are variations on it. I think of them as having kind of done some of the most sophisticated work to get into the details of the theory, to articulate and respond to objections. And evidentialism is pretty straightforward the way I've got it set out here, right? What it says is that what you're justified in believing at any given time is entirely determined by your total evidence at that time, right? So the idea is that each of us at any given moment, let's suppose when you're functioning normally, you're not in a coma, or your senses aren't completely a sensory deprivation tank or something, but in normal sort of world situations, each of us has accorded to us a certain body of evidence. What is that? Well, that's a question that has to be dealt with, but for now, let's think of it as your other justified beliefs and experiences. All right? So I'm not giving a sort of definition of justification here. It's kind of like a recursive definition, but suppose that the concept of justified belief is is a bona fide concept that it's real, and suppose you've got some of those already, then what you ought to believe from the standpoint of rationality, of epistemic rationality, is at a given time is determined by that total body of evidence. So your other justified beliefs and your experiences, perceptual experiences, memory experiences, introspective experiences, right? All the different sources that we've kind of already familiarized ourselves with. And the idea, and here's kind of a simple way of thinking about it. I've used this example before in other contexts, but so we've got a body of evidence concerning some proposition P, right? Whatever P is, that it's 49 degrees outside, or that, you know, it's gonna snow on Friday, or whatever. And so here's that little seesaw, little teeter-totter, right? And let's just, to make it easy, consider this the positive end of the spectrum, and this is the negative end. And all I mean by that is that these are reasons for thinking that P is true. And these are reasons for thinking that P is not true. All right? So there's only three ways this thing can play out. And there's hand waving involved, but there are people that are working on filling in the details in terms of how exactly one should adjust one's beliefs in light of new information and new evidence. A lot of the work in formal epistemology, Bayesian epistemology, focuses on that. So if you like Bayesian's probability and statistics, right, then that'd be a place. I can point you to some articles for that. So one way it can happen is that you take all the reasons, and I'll just use reasons as an umbrella term here for your justified beliefs and experiences that are relevant to the situation. This is all the reasons for thinking the belief is true, right? What you do is you subtract all the reasons for thinking that it's not true from the reasons for thinking that it is, and there's only three ways it could play out. Again, kind of a hand-waving move, but it's not just the number of reasons or the sheer amount of evidence. It's got to have to also take into consideration the quality of the evidence, right? You might have 20 reasons for thinking something, and they're not really strong or weighty reasons, and then you've got 4 or 5 reasons that qualitatively are superior. So there's got to be some story about how we strike a balance between quality and quantity, but effectively, when you subtract the reasons against from the reasons in favor, either it's going to be heavier on this end, and it's going to go down, right, the weight of it, and so then you believe the statement. Or maybe the reasons in favor, or reasons against rather, are going to outnumber, right, the reasons in favor, and it's going to weigh more on this end, so the fulcrum's going to go down, and this is the not believe end of things. Or one other possibility that we have to consider that I think is sometimes overlooked and given kind of a bad rap is the possibility that when we subtract the reasons against from the reasons in favor, they're going to essentially neutralize each other. It's what we call being counterbalanced. And if that's the case, then it's right here in the middle. It's 50-50, right? What evidentialism says is that if it turns out this way, the attitude that's justified is belief. That's the rational thing for you to do. If it goes this way, then you've got to disbelieve it, believe that it's not true. And if it should turn out that you're in this situation right here, then you got to suspend judgment. That's the right thing to do. Now, you might wonder, I mean, how often is this the case? I mean, in everyday life, it seems like, even though it can be hard to do this sort of weighing that I'm talking about, right, for different reasons, in everyday life, oftentimes maybe it's clearer, right? One side really does seem to have better reasons than the other. I mean, not talking about philosophical discussions and debates now, but just in everyday things. And so maybe this seems like it's not going to come into play that much, but looks like it could. I mean, anybody think of an example, a case where that's pretty straightforward, where it looks like suspending judgment's the rational thing for you to do?
Maybe on religious matters, God's existence.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Alan. So God's existence, so maybe you think after a careful consideration of the most important arguments for thinking that there is a God and the most important arguments for thinking that there's not a God, that at the end of the day, they're going to implode, they're going to neutralize each other, and that agnosticism, that's how I think about the agnostic position, right, is that agnostics from the Greek root word there, gnosis, right? Agnosis, no knowledge, can't know. I think you can't know one way or the other whether there's a God, and that the rational person suspends judgment. Right? Just out of curiosity, how many people had philosophy of religion here?
Yeah.
Pretty good handful. Okay, cool. Yeah. And with Hoffman and with Professor Rosencrantz? Or
Yeah,
Professor
Professor
Hoffman?
Rosencrantz.
No. You had somewhere else?
No, I didn't hear that.
Okay. Wow, I can't believe that. I can't believe he ever taught philosophy of religion. Would it have been? Was it a summer? Was it a summer thing or a winter thing?
It was in the fall a few years ago.
Really? Okay. Wasn't Hoffman though. It was definitely Zimmerman.
Often I had for, I think it was ancient.
Well, online or face to face?
Online.
Okay. Very good. That's curious to me, but so in any case, yeah. I mean, here's maybe one that's less controversial because I mean, I think that you could make the case like you're doing, but because the topic is God's existence and it's such a big topic in the philosophy of religion and in metaphysics, and people are pretty passionate about it. It seems a lot of times. Maybe something that's not going to have that kind of fanfare associated with it, right? So, I mean, here's the kind of case. Suppose I have a coin, it's a fair coin, heads and tails. It's not one of those funny coins with two heads or something that you use to win bets in bars. And it's not not that kind of thing. Here, you want to bet? That'll win them every time. So you got a fair coin, I flip a coin, and I look at it, I know how it landed, and I put it in my pocket, and I don't show you guys how it landed. Now I'm asking you to consider the statement that the coin landed heads. And you think to yourself, okay, well, I mean, I don't really have any evidence. I didn't see how it landed. He hasn't told me. So I shouldn't believe that one. My evidence doesn't support it. But you know that if it didn't land heads, it had to land tails. It's the only other option. It didn't land on its side, its edge. Now, so you consider the statement that it landed tails, right? And you're in the exact same situation. Seems to me like the right thing to do in a case like that is to suspend judgment. Just, you don't believe that it landed heads, you don't believe that it landed tails, but you know it landed one or the other way, right? So one point that comes out of this way of thinking about suspending is that it could be I think it can be the rationally justified thing for you to do, but bear in mind that if you do it, you'll never get knowledge, right? Because as we'll soon see when we get to the analysis of knowledge, the traditional analysis, belief is an essential component. And so if you don't believe the statement, you can't very well be said to know it. Doesn't make any sense. Yeah, Dominic.
But can't you suspend judgment for a while and then still gather evidence and data?
Yeah.
And then come to disbelief or belief because
yeah, sure.
I mean, I've been in other philosophy
That's what we
classes
do.
where there's you have the whole semester talking about a certain topic, and at the end you're just like, I don't know what to think about it.
Yeah.
I know what to think about it, both sides, because I had that conversation with people before, what do you think? I really don't know.
But you're better off for it, right?
Because for me saying I don't know doesn't mean I don't know what they're saying on both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah. You just don't know which one's right.
Exactly. So I think you can suspend judgment, but then you can also have
it's not a
good
belief.
amount of knowledge, kind of. Can you?
What? See, we may be on the same page. You tell me if I'm getting you right. I can certainly, and I think a lot of us do say, well, right now, given my situation, I think I've got to suspend because the jury's out, so to speak, right? I mean, it may not. This is just sort of a figurative thing, right?
So in Professor Van Vossen's class, we were talking about immigration.
Yeah.
And we heard arguments for and against.
Mm-hmm.
And so if someone's asking my position, I'd be like, well, I really don't know because I know the arguments for and I know the arguments against.
Right.
But
it's hard to decide.
But it's hard to decide. Yeah. So
yeah.
I would say that I have a small amount of knowledge on the topic, but
yeah, certainly.
I don't have a certain belief on it because he talked about it in here, and I kind of disagreed when he said you have to have belief before you have knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think you can have knowledge on a empirical claim of the world and the way the world is,
yeah.
But you don't have a belief on which way you should sway towards the arguments. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's why I got kind of confused when he was talking about that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah,
belief has to create knowledge.
This is helping them. Yeah, this will help me out because I think once we get to the analysis, I can make the case that it does follow that you know a proposition only if you believe it. Because I think that belief's a necessary, though not a sufficient condition for knowledge. That's just trotting out the traditional analysis. Mm-hmm. Maybe if I'm understanding you, maybe here's something that would help, right? I mean, you can certainly suspend judgment on a question, neither believe one way or the other, and at the same time continue looking for more information to help tilt the balance one way or the other, right? I mean, but during that time when you're not believing one way or the other, what you know isn't the statement in question. It's not a counterexample to the necessity of belief, of the belief condition, I think. I think what it is that you do believe some other stuff, like you believe the proposition. Suppose the proposition is that it's gonna, you know, that, I'm trying to think of an example here. The proposition that you're considering is that it'll snow on Friday. We've been using that example since it's timely, right? And maybe you think to yourself, suppose the weather models really were very equivocal, right? Like you looked at them and the European model says they're not going to get anything, or it's going to be a rain event. And the North American model says, no, it's going to be a snow event. And suppose freezing rain's not an option, just to make things simple, right? Because that's right in the middle, it's complicated. Well, if the evidence of both, and suppose the track records of both of those models have been, they're equally good. Half the time, North American model gets it right. Half the time, the European model gets it right. Given only that information, and you're now considering the statement that it will snow on Friday, what do you believe? Well, I don't believe that. Well, do you believe the statement that it won't snow on Friday, that it'll be rain instead if those are the only two options? No, you don't believe that either, right? Because your evidence doesn't support strongly enough belief either way. But here are some other things that you know. You know that the future's getting closer. You know that the information will get better a day from now, presumably, because they'll have more information to work with. You know that, you know, various other things, that maybe that there's going to be updates to the models tomorrow. So there is other stuff you can know, but when it comes to the proposition in question, this is why I think, again, getting a statement, really nailing down what is the statement that's at issue here, that one person's saying they know and the other person's saying they don't, or, you know, what is, because you can know some other stuff, for sure,
Okay,
but it's
yeah,
background stuff or stuff that's relevant to
But you
future
don't actually, for
inquiry.
example, I like how you would say like, okay, yeah, you know, there's the evidence pro and con, but you don't know actually, was it justified to have?
How it all links together.
Yeah,
But you have all
exactly.
the pieces. Yeah.
Right, and you've got some other, and the good news is you can, like Tyler's saying, you can have these other, you know, some background beliefs and additional context that, you know, makes you want, and that's why people do science, right? I mean, among other things, as they say, you know, this seems to be, this is the working model, this is the hypothesis, we're gonna, and what's the first thing a lot of times that happens when somebody publishes a scientific result? There's a whole bunch of teams everywhere else in the world go to try to replicate it, right? To see if the results hold up, if they're borne out. And people try to refute it, right, by coming up with like a crucial experiment that if the model's wrong would reveal that whatever the shortcoming is. So good, yeah, I appreciate that. So one other thing about evidentialism, we'll get a lot more of this throughout the semester, but notice that it makes whether you're justified in the belief or not, a function of complying with or conforming your beliefs to the total evidence available to you. There's a distinction that's crucial, and a lot of times, especially in introductory level courses, not with people at your level, but I'll find students get kind of turned around on this. They'll say stuff like, well, you can't prove it either way, like when it comes to God. Well, you can't prove it, or, you know, or science has proven. They'll throw the word proof around really lightly. Then I have a little quick spiel that I usually go into at that point on why I'm really careful, or try to be careful, about using that sort of language. To me, the only place that it's really, where it's first and foremost appropriate to talk about proving something is in logic and mathematics. You took logic, you know what you do proofs, and they get hard, right? And you know about advanced mathematics, where you do proofs again, and they get hard. So the reason those places are where you hear that concept come up is because you're dealing with formal languages, artificial languages that are purpose designed for being able to prove things. And a proof literally is a series of steps, each one of which is either an axiom or a premise or a theorem, something that was proven from some other place that you're allowed to use, a lemma or whatever, or it has to be derived from previous steps by the application of a valid inference rule. That's it. That's the, I mean, remember geometry, remember 310, right? Every single step has to have a justification, and if you can't produce that, then it's not a proof. It's just junk. It's just a bunch of sequences, right? So I think the same thing happens in introductory philosophy discussions a lot of times where people they use the word proof in a kind of fast and loose way, and it often is just supposed to be a synonym for something like there's very little empirical evidence for it, or science that's not the dominant scientific view, or maybe even more in a more limited sense, it's not, you can't experience it directly with your five senses, or you can't see it or touch it or whatever. Instead of talking about proof, what they really should be talking about is the quality of the evidence available, the quality and quantity of evidence available for thinking the thing's true, wherever it comes from, whether it's purely conceptual argumentation or whether it's empirical in the sense that you're perceiving it or whatever. They don't do that, right? And so this distinction that I have in mind is between total evidence, which is what evidentialism requires, total evidential support, which is just a seesaw thing, where you subtract all the cons from all the pros and you see where it shakes out. That's different than conclusive evidence or conclusive reasons, right? So conclusive evidence is evidence that's so good you couldn't have that evidence and be wrong. I mean, you don't have to think for long. I mean, the introductory epistemology kind of thing, that the chances that we're going to have a lot of that kind of evidence, that our reasons in everyday situations rise to that high standard, it's not encouraging, right? I mean, I have all kinds of reasons right now for thinking I know where my car is parked. I think I do know where my car is parked. But I also recognize that every day in Greensboro, cars are stolen. There are bad people out there that do these things. I also realize that cars get towed. Maybe I was negligent and wasn't aware of a no parking sign, or maybe I was taking my chances with the UNCG cops, the traffic guys, right? And I'm hoping that the car is still there. I parked illegally to get a good close parking spot in this bad weather. But either way, the quality of the evidence that I've got for any ordinary sort of claim never seems to rise, for the most part, to the level of conclusive reasons or conclusive evidence, right? I mean, this is why Descartes is able to make so much of that in meditations, right? When he's imagining all these various skeptical possibilities, because and we'll see this when we get to skepticism as well, right? I mean, a lot of those arguments turn on the idea that you could have exactly the same evidence or similar evidence to the point where it'd be indistinguishable to you, for you, whether you're in a classroom right now with other people or whether you're a disembodied brain in a vat somewhere. You're some kid's science project. Right? You're in the basement of Eberhard. Some grad students, got you hooked up to a computer that's stimulating you so as to give you the experiences, the qualitative experiences, right, that you would be having were you here right now in the class with the rest of the kids, but you're not. I mean, it seems ridiculous, and people, the first reaction most people have is, oh, come on, you gotta be kidding me. Now we're gonna worry about the Matrix and evil demons and whether I'm dreaming. I mean, don't we have let's do some real philosophy, right? Well, to me, that is real philosophy, but certainly not always clear to people what the practical value of thinking about that stuff is when we've got a lot of down-to-earth, real practical problems that maybe philosophers can help us with as well. So good. So that's kind of my spiel on this stuff. And I'll put some notes out on Canvas for you tonight, tomorrow, as soon as I can get to it. The next thing I was going to do is just start thinking about Chapter 1, Chapter 2. And you guys wrote in the first discussion, the second discussion, real discussion board, I asked you a question about the different views that Feldman described. So there's the standard view, right? There's the skeptical view, there's the naturalistic view, and there's the relativistic view. And I was interested to see what people thought who had a chance to think about it. And I want you to feel free to say what you think or to tell me, but before we do all of that, questions about the standard view at all? I mean, I'm happy to, he outlined several different theses, right? Yeah.
How come the standard view lays claim to like the sources of knowledge that we have, like A through F that he gave? Perception, memory, testimony, perception, reasoning, and rational insight. How come, I mean, I don't know, to me when I was reading it, like that was kind of like the one way that swayed me towards the standard view is I was like, okay, well, how else are we supposed to get information and knowledge other than those senses, and like other than A through F? And if A through F was in another view, then it might sway it. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. So I mean, like, you were sort of already on board then.
I mean, it just kind of seemed like, okay, well, how else are you supposed to get knowledge? Like, how else are you supposed to explain how we get knowledge?
Right, and that's the fundamental question, right? I mean, that's how he starts, that's how he motivates it. He has all those examples of things we know, or things that we ordinarily take ourselves to know, right? I mean, there's this distinction between knowledge and apparent knowledge, and certainly Feldman, I don't think, the way I think about how Feldman's approaching this is, look, it's kind of like Chisholm did this earlier kind of thing, where he said, look, there's a presumption in favor of certain beliefs that we've got, right? I mean, these are our ordinary everyday beliefs, and sure, we recognize that they could turn out to be wrong. Oftentimes they are wrong. That's not going to change probably with most of these, outside of logic, mathematics, a few conceptual truths, and maybe some claims about your own states of mind, though that's more controversial. So he says, look, you know, I'm going to start off with the assumption that here's the standard view. These are examples of things that we ordinarily think we know or take ourselves to know, and we're going to investigate to see if those things can be justified, if they can turn out to actually, if we really know them or not, right? And so in constructing this list of basic sources of knowledge, yeah, I mean, you have to keep in mind, I mean, you could turn out to, skepticism could be true about any of these different areas of knowledge. I mean, it may be that, suppose we can know a lot about our own minds, but we can't ever really know much about the external world for reasons like Descartes would find compelling, right? So you could be an external world skeptic and still have introspection on your list. You could have memory on your list, and you could have certainly reasoning, deductive reasoning at least, right?
But why couldn't that fit underneath the naturalistic view? Because it's like naturalistic view laid claim to like empirical sciences.
Yeah, and you like that. I remember you were saying you were sympathetic to
because I was like,
bringing that to bear.
Yeah, that makes sense, but also like I feel like the standard view can kind of like swallow up the naturalistic view because like to me everything you use for the empirical sciences go through A through F. Like there's no other sense that like you can really do empirical science without tapping into A through F.
Okay, great.
And
Yeah. So why isn't the naturalistic view part of the standard view?
Well,
or so to speak,
why
I mean, it's a component.
why is that distinction really made? Because I didn't understand that, you know, because through A through F you can derive empirical sciences.
Right. Well, good. Let me try to help out with that. I appreciate it. And that's why I want you guys to do these discussion boards if you can before our meetings, because this is a lot more fun than just me didactically lecturing for sure, and it hopefully answers questions that you've thought about. So here's a short answer that you won't find very satisfying. Feldman wrote the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on naturalized epistemology, and he's critical of it. And he's a standard view adherent, but he's not a real nut about naturalized epistemology. I know this because my dissertation was on naturalized epistemology, more than you would ever want to read of it, over 400 pages long. It's a monster. So that's the short, not very compelling, good philosophical reason. Here's the better reason. These are the sources of knowledge according to the standard view, but notice that the only two of the sources that most philosophers, and again, this is going to be harder in some ways because here in our department, we've got more variety now than we've ever had. We've got a mix of people that are all professional philosophers with different backgrounds, different orientations, different interests, right? So you might think, well, look, I mean, on this talk on immigration that's coming up, or our drug policy or whatever that's coming up, those are practical matters, and how can empirical facts not be relevant to what we should think about those questions, right? That's kind of the naturalistic line. But Feldman, he's coming from the perspective, and this has to do with the philosophical method or methodology, that the vast majority of philosophical questions, the core classical questions, the only sources that make any sense or that hold out any hope for getting us progress are reasoning and rational insight. Consider the question, does God exist? You can't perceive it. You can't perceive the answer to that one. We already figured it out, right? If there was an empirical study we could do, we can go and study how many people believe that God exists, but that's just a sociology of religious belief or psychology of religious belief. Consider the question of are we free or are we determined? Do we have free will, and if so, what does that mean? You can't remember the answer to that without having learned it to start with, right? So memory won't help. What about the question of can we ever really know anything? Well, you could ask me. I'm supposed to be an expert. I'm an epistemologist, and you can believe what I say on the basis of testimony. But that's not. I mean, again, you're just getting it from some source. We want to know, how did the source get it, right? introspection, you know, and that'll tell you whether or not you got a headache or whether you're bored, but it won't answer your questions about what's the difference between right and wrong. Now you could learn what your thoughts are on right and wrong. Like, I can know that I think that moral realism is probably true, but that's not the same as establishing that moral realism is true. That's just knowing my own thought on the matter, right? So as you go through the kind of classical, and again, this is with some deference to folks like Professor van der Wassen and the folks that are interested in applied ethics, because my own view has changed a little bit over the years. Earlier on in my career, I was much more sympathetic to this, like, philosophy is an a priori activity. It involves conceptual analysis, philosophical analysis, and empirical results are largely irrelevant to answering philosophical questions. I now sort of take I think it's a little bit more of a moderate position, that there are different kinds of there are purely empirical questions, right? How many people are in the room next door? It's an empirical question. Let's go count them and see if there's any in there, right? Then there are pure philosophical questions. I do believe there is an a priori realm for philosophers to inhabit, and those are some of the questions I just mentioned, the big classical questions in metaphysics, epistemology, meta-ethics and normative ethics as opposed to applied ethics. And then I think there's this weird hybrid ground that sort of started to become really popular over the past, I don't know, since Quine wrote Epistemology Naturalized in '69, but even before that, there's an area where to answer the question, we need both some philosophical input and some empirical input, right? So maybe some questions about, say, let's see, is the fetus a person at any point early on in its development or from the moment of conception? Well, clearly there's an a priori or conceptual, I'll just say conceptual component to that, which is, well, what is a person, right? I mean, there's lots of different analyses of personhood. That's where I think of myself as a philosopher being maybe of some help. But then there's this other question, which is, okay, once we've established what it is to be a person, whatever we're going to mean by that concept, does the fetus satisfy the concept? Well, I mean, I've never had anything to do with the fetus. I mean, nothing against them, but I mean, I'm not a scientist. I'm not an OBGYN. I'm not an embryologist or somebody who studies these things. And so, I wouldn't, if somebody said, well, here's what we're going to mean by person, and now you got to check and see whether this concept applies to X. The checking and seeing whether it applies or not has never been my focus, because that's the dirty work, that's the wet work, right? You got to get your hands dirty there. And I'm not disparaging any of that. I think that, I love science, but I also think that I'm a philosophy person, not a scientist. I'm a philosopher. So, it may be that I think that three-tiered kind of structure could work. And so the reason Feldman doesn't see the naturalistic view as embedded within the standard view, sure, things like perception, testimony, reasoning, they're all sources that the naturalists also use. What the naturalists typically want to resist, though, is this idea of rational insight, which I remember Tyler was kind of making faces about when we discussed it a while back, right? That there is this a priori, purely conceptual sort of thing that we can know just by pure reflection. It's controversial. It goes all the way back to the debate between the rationalists and the empiricists, right? So depending on the type of naturalism and how strong or moderate it is, there are people like Quine who famously said that epistemology just falls in line as a chapter of psychology. And so the way he frames the debate, it's sort of like, here's all these traditional epistemological questions. I haven't shown them yet, but you read the chapter, you know the kind of things Feldman's talking about. What is knowledge? What's the extent of our knowledge? What should we do to ensure that our beliefs are rational? All this kind of stuff. Quine comes along and says, well, those questions either have to be answered within the science of psychology, how people actually go about forming their beliefs, or they're not good questions. To me that's a drag, because that cuts out like what I was all excited about doing in epistemology. If I wanted to go and study how people actually form beliefs, I would have done psychology or cognitive science, right? And that's awesome stuff. I think that's really neat too. But I don't think we should confuse the different questions, So I think that's maybe why Feldman doesn't subsume it underneath the standard view, though you can see how if you think, look, my interest in philosophy are in these hybrid questions that have a partly conceptual component and a partly empirical component, well then, yeah, sure, that's a moderate kind of naturalism. There are people, famous people out there that have defended that, people like Hillary Kornbluth, yeah.
So is it a little just more reductionist, so to speak, all in all? Is that kind of the difference between the traditional and naturalistic? That's what it seems like.
Say some more about how you're meaning reductionist.
Just, it seems like it kind of is relying on the base ideas of perception
Yeah.
and memory.
They like that stuff.
Yeah,
And then they don't, and then they of course they engage in reasoning, like
Sure.
all science engages in reasoning, deductive and inductive.
but they would argue that it all stems from
It's all based in observation.
perception. Okay.
Yeah. It's basically, I mean, a lot of that, the naturalistic view is a kind of, is a sort of throwback to classical empiricism in a lot of ways. So you think about Locke and Berkeley and Hume, right? And the idea that all of our knowledge has to somehow be grounded in the operation of our five senses. Well, I mean, another famous quote from Quine comes to mind, that philosophy is just science gone self-conscious. Right, I mean, so it's kind of like the only questions there are to answer are scientific questions, and if it can't be addressed within the sciences, then maybe philosophers have just been wasting their time, right? I mean, again, that itself is inspired by the positivism of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, the verificationist movement, right? Let's face it, it's frustrating. You look at the history of science, especially recent science, the past 100 years or so, and there's all this tremendous progress. You look at the history of philosophy, I think, therefore I am. And we gotta do better than that. There's gotta be more, right? I mean, that's cool. I like the cogito. But, so you might think that the track record that philosophers have to sort of hold up for themselves, it doesn't inspire lots of confidence there that we're making progress on these things, right? If I still am having trouble knowing that I'm not dreaming right now or that I'm not in the matrix, something's gone horribly wrong. I know people that feel that way. And then we want to address these more thinking of like applied philosophy, applied ethics, applied social and political philosophy, those areas, right? Medical ethics, environmental ethics, food ethics, business ethics. These are all efforts to try to take a branch of philosophy, namely moral philosophy or ethics, right? And mix it with some real world considerations, some real empirical input there. So yeah, good, I appreciate it. Well guys, I've gone over and I didn't mean to keep you, so sorry about that. Thanks very much, and I'll see you all on Monday.